all for coming. I'm going to turn it over to the introducer for this week, which is Linda Russo. Just wanted to ask you, because the muting on arrival doesn't work, if you could make sure that unless you're the person reading, you're muted, that would be just wonderful. And I'm going to turn off the chat room during the reading, but I'll open it up as soon as the reading's over and invite you all to stay and engage in dialogue or use the chat room. We tend to have a discussion after each reading, and we'd love to have you take part in that too. So turning it over then to Linda. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, hi, everyone. I'm Linda Russo. I'm a contributor to the anthology, and I'm just here to be your hostess for today. So I want to say thank you to Cole, and also to the editors, Bernard Quetchenbach, Sarah Nolan, and Mary Newell, and to tell you a little bit about the Poetics for the More Than Human World anthology. So I'm going to try to pop some links into the chat. You could take a quick look at these if it works. And
Wait, I just turned the chat off. So right. let me go back and turn it on for you.
Well, they might be there. So anyway, the link's in the chat. You can pre-order the anthology from Spuyten Duyvil at the contributors discount through July, so through the end of tomorrow. And well, no, you can order it, but through the end of July, the press is going to pay your postage to one or more addresses. And I'm not sure about the contributors discount. Mary, does it still apply after tomorrow?
A second. My understanding is that it does. It's just that your postage won't be covered, but you can order until it's actually printed, which means through August, probably. You can order as many copies as you wish at the contributor discount, which is $20.
Okay, great.
So, anyway.
So there's also a link to the online manifestation of the anthology if you want to check out more about the contributors or more of the contents. And let's see, there's a link to the CHAC's YouTube channel where these readings and discussions are being archived. So thank you, Charles Alexander. And there's also a link to the Facebook group if you want to join and stay up to date or, I don't know, have a little conversation if that happens there. So over the weeks, the participants in this Zoom series, the readers and audience alike, have considered many concepts around ecopoetics, as it has become known as a genre, and ecopoiesis itself, and the idea of a poetics in relation to the more than human world. Each week, this is collectively spun anew through the readings that are offered, and I look forward to today's discussion, and I encourage you to stick around. Use your mic if you have it. If you don't, feel free to post questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to verbalize them and bring them into the discussion. And all right, on with the reading. And now I'm very pleased to present today's readers. I won't offer any introduction, just I'm going to say their name and let them jump in and begin. So our first reader today is Marybeth Holleman.
Hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the foothills of the Chugach Mountains in Anchorage, Alaska. On the unceded lands of the Dena'ina people and of spruce and birch, wolf and bear, salmon and raven. I want to thank Mary, Bernard, Charles, Cole, and Linda for all you're doing to bring this collection into the world. And it's really an honor to be among a group of such innovative poets. And my dogs just started barking. I hope you don't hear them. I'm going to read 2 poems, including my poem in the anthology. They're also both in my first poetry collection, Tender Gravity, which is forthcoming from Red Hen Press. The first poem, Rock Poem. If you read my memoir, The Heart of the Sound, you'll find out that I spend a lot of time sitting in front of receding glaciers and looking at the bare rock that's just been released from centuries of ice, and looking at the granite that's tattooed by ice and thinking about time. So this poem takes place in front of the Sawyer Glacier in the Tongass. Rock poem. Awed by the patterns, I say, I'd like to be here with a geologist. And you say, one was here once, an old guy who said, wow, this is some ugly rock. And I'm thinking that is the last word I'd use to describe it. Ugly, he meant tortured. He knew the processes that led to these starburst scrolling fractures, white scribbles across gray, orange shimmering splashes undercut by green. He knew these color patterns evidenced a long mutilation of bedrock granite. But for me, sitting on the headland, it's the epitome of beauty, draws my gaze again and again. The lines are messages scrawled by giants. The earth is speaking to me in a language I do not yet understand. My next poem is the one that is in the anthology. And just a note on the form, each line starts with the preposition with, and I'm grateful to Arthur Z, who spoke earlier in the series, for his poem Here, which also starts with the word here in each line, and it inspired the form that I used for this poem. I was also thinking about the moments that I've spent throughout my life so far in the presence of non-human life. All these profound interspecies encounters, which is my favorite kind of pie. And all the moments they've allowed me to share with them. And I'm always filled with gratitude for those moments. And so this is in praise of them. With Stellar J tapping at the window for peanuts, telling me weather's cooling, winter comes. With the lion climbing the snowy mountainside, 6 in a row, black wolves. With gazelle chased by cheetah, both so fleet, me saying no, while my son says go. With thin black cat laying 2 small fish on our doorstep for her kittens inside. With my nephew's snake my son holds in both hands. With small black beetle whispering into the rock around my pansies. With grosbeak's song tumbling light as dry snow down through the trees, asking for sunflower seeds. With ground squirrel kits whose chatter reverberates through derelict gold mine pipe they make home. With pulsating orbs of white spread below my kayak, a gathering of moon jellies mirroring sky's clouds. With 3 black snakes sunning together on a boulder in springtime woods. With the spray of their exhale misting my face as 2 humpbacks leap from glowing seas. With a dangling thread just before my eyes, inchworm hanging from the willow, green yew turning. With adopted son conure whose shrieks still rainbow in my ear, though I regret not a single moment of him on my shoulder, nibbling strands of my hair. With small black puppy at Ulm Beach, gnawing on a dead crab, the sacred bloated cow nuzzling a pile of trash nearby. With black dog at my feet, soft groan as I stroke the silk of her back. With river otters tumbling over one another along the barnacled shoreline, one head lifting when my shutter clicks. With night bunny under the roses, beautiful bones ticking time's soft rhythm. With black bear searching in hungry spring for birdseed we miss, batting at the garden hose, down on forearms to lap from the dog's water bowl. With the baby gang, chickadee, nuthatch, junco, newly fledged, alighting in birch, learning the bird bath. With bats circling at dusk my head, dancing to my runner's high. With gray squirrel high in the oak, scrambling to avoid the BB shots of neighbor boys, my mother chases screaming from our backyard. With my husky racing over tundra like blossoming wind, quick becoming small as seed. with a pair of mountain goats pressed against cliffs lining Crow Pass, watching hikers toil. With 2 frogs under the lilacs, one who lived 2 decades, our own Tut everlasting. With red fox trotting by our tent in the Arctic summer night, red tongue out, panting, so light-footed she leaves no prints in soft mud. With bumblebee bouncing off the window, wanting the colors of flowers my walls wear. With polar bear pushing black snout against the window I raised just in time, leaving in dusty glass a single paw print, shimmer by the night's aurora. With king salmon in the stream, termination dust on their dorsals, slowing tails to list into gentler current. With the rolling thunder of hooves across my dreams, the licks of 1,000 rough tongues, the harmony of songs lifted to limitless blue, every day and night, world without end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marybeth. Our next reader today is Adam Dickinson.
Thank you very much. I'm a writer from Canada. I teach poetics and creative writing at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, just by way of a quick introduction. Thank you to Mary and Sarah and Bernard for editing, and thanks also to Cole and Linda for hosting the readings. In my work, I'm interested in bringing into focus what I think of as the often inscrutable biological and cultural writing intrinsic to the Anthropocene, especially as this is reflected in the inextricable link between the metabolic processes of human and non-human bodies and how this relates to the global metabolism of energy and capital. Most recently, I explored this in a book I wrote called Anatomic that responds to chemical and microbial tests that I conducted on my body. So I looked into my blood, my urine, and my shit, and I saw the Anthropocene staring back at me, for example, in the form of chemicals I could trace to specific corporations. But today I'm going to read from some new work that extends what I've been doing in terms of thinking about metabolism, writing, and the Anthropocene. I've been working with heat. I've been asking myself, how do we imagine writing with and about heat in a warming world? What forms of writing might emerge when heat and its effects are invited into the compositional process? So with the assistance of the Environmental Ergonomics Laboratory at Brock University, where I work, I undertook several heat stress trials. So I raised my internal body temperature by around 1.5 degrees Celsius through both active and passive heating. So the active heating involved me cycling on a stationary bicycle in controlled conditions of 35 degrees Celsius with 65% humidity, which equaled a humidex of 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The passive heating involved me wearing a specialized hot water piped garment under a few layers of thermal blankets for several hours. The passive heating experiment resulted in prolonged exposure to the critical wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, which is the point at which the human body can no longer cool itself by sweating. So wet bulb temperature is the lowest possible measurement obtainable by evaporation alone. I won't go into the mechanics of how it's actually determined. But once this temperature is reached, the human body can't cool itself by sweating. So even healthy people sitting in the shade will die within 6 hours or so. This particular atmospheric condition is expected to become more frequent and widespread with time. As recently as a couple of years ago in Iran, there was a city in which the afternoon temperature reached 46 degrees Celsius and the humidity was 50%. So this combined to create a wet bulb temperature of 34.6 degrees Celsius. So just on the verge of these deadly conditions. So I exposed myself to this for a period of time. Obviously, I stopped the experiment before it became fatal. But I wanted to sort of pursue and experience this heat and live with this heat and write with it. So at various intervals during these trials, I wrote, I took cognitive tests, I measured my core temperature, my skin temperature, blood pressure, CO2 uptake, brain blood flow, among other data. And so I've used this data and some of these experiences to start to develop forms of writing that, as I'm trying to do here, sort of approach the environment through the signifying framework of temperature extremes. So the more I reflected on my experiences of hyperthermia, the more I thought of fevers, bad dreams, addled thinking. Global warming has already given rise to conspiracy theories and desperate pressurized thinking, as vulnerable populations themselves have become desperate and pressurized. So with that in mind, this poem is called Perspiration, a Conspiracy. An early draft of a lubricant for getting the hell out, the engineered conclusion in which the flight attendant doctors the drink with an emergency exit over the Canaries, trailing afterlives like blisters of a herpes outbreak or the punished grin of a lack of means. Swollen marshmallows are drooling over the fire. Their sunburns follow the predictable misshapen plots in the annals of medical science. Trees named after ashes were always more likely to get it in the end. It's too sunny to look directly back from where we came, and now our money requires huge fans to keep it cool. In another experiment, I turned to cockroaches. Cockroaches are hardy creatures, and their distribution around the planet has occurred in conjunction with colonial conquests and the spread of multinational capitalism. The cockroaches that are common in North America, for example, arrived on slave ships. So there's this connection between colonialism, capitalism, and cockroaches and their distribution. They're, of course, very hardy, adaptive creatures, as many of you know. And I wanted to think about the sort of lessons that their thermoregulatory processes offer us for thinking responses to heat. How might they help us metabolize our fever dreams about the future in a hotter world? So I performed an experiment. I measured the change in biomass with two different groups of cockroaches. I used Bleptica dubia, and I had several groups living for 5 weeks on top of the first 2 pages of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, which is a story, of course, as you know, about a man who turns into an insect, commonly assumed to be a cockroach, not necessarily, but assumed to be. So I had a control group at 30 degrees Celsius, along with another group at 32 degrees Celsius, responding to the 2 degrees escalation in global temperature that's expected at least in the next few years. The small experiment produced inconclusive results in terms of biomass change, but all groups defiled the text. They ate parts of it. They defecated on large swaths of it. In fact, those at the most elevated temperatures appeared to defile it the most. Kafka's text is a kind of apocalyptic narrative of metabolic proportions. We might say, man turns into bug, man fails to provide for family in the expected way, and as a result, the metabolic mechanisms of exploitive employment begin to be exposed. Moreover, the text invites us to consider, it seems to me, the bad dream or the feverish vision of transformation. So this poem, I'll just read you one of these poems. I have some pictures and images to show, but it's too complicated to do that here, so I will save that for now. But the poem, this poem was made by drawing together legible words and letters unobscured by excrement from the first 2 pages of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, which I used to line the base of each of the cockroach enclosures. It's called Awakened. As grass, as smoke, one morning dome-like, divided by a bed. Numerous legs waved a regular human recently cut out of a forearm. Raindrops beat a little longer, forgetting this accused sleep thought didn't hold. Sacked, spot, cut, clock, possible ear packed up a row of waiting spines. Far wrong after a long sleep, a cautious tap at the head of a voice train. The matter called the other side, thankful for habit to get up quietly. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Adam. I would like to welcome our next reader today, Lynn Keller.
Hi, thank you. I'm recently retired from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm the author most recently of the book Recomposing ECOPOETIcs, North American Poetry of the Self-Conscious Anthropocene. Like the other readers, I want to thank the editors for putting together this monumental anthology. And I want to thank Cole and Linda for organizing this wonderfully rewarding reading series. I also want to thank Cole for wanting to include in this series someone like me, a publishing critic rather than a publishing poet. It is an honor to read here. And I appreciate the implicit acknowledgement both that eco-criticism is an important partner to eco-poetry and that literary critics like myself are also writers. So I'm going to read a section from my essay in the anthology. The essay examines the role of walking in Brian Tier's powerful collection, Doomstead Days. That volume was prompted initially by his witnessing the effects of this massive Cusco-Busan oil spill in the San Francisco Bay, an ecological disaster that he could walk to. In the essay, I explore how he grapples with the problematically elitist environmental tradition of walking in nature to escape the ills of civilization. I'm going to start in medias res, but I hope at least also end there. But I hope at least to share enough kind of tantalizing snippets from Doomstead Days that you'll be inspired to read the whole book. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, good. All right. Impurity is the focus of the longest of the book's 8 poems, Toxics Release Inventory, parens, Essay on Man, written as Tier came to know Philadelphia and its environs after leaving the West Coast. The poem takes the form of a 50-page string of haikus. However, defying haiku's association with suspended moments of seasonal beauty and challenging the optimism of Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, to which his subtitle refers, Tier produces a city-based poem largely about environmental toxins that exposes the illusion of boundaries between man-made and natural, pure and polluted. Although initially positioning himself as an alienated observer of the cityscape, increasingly he presents his own body in intercorporeal terms as a part of the place and its deadly pollution. In the early pages, Tier depicts a city in negative ways Thoreau might endorse, even using some of the economic language fundamental to Walden's critique of town ways. Quote, "The city conducts its business, trading the wishes of citizens for empty actuality we walk out into. The future a proffered naught beneath our feet, sealed, soil infertile, streets and sidewalks yielding nothing but surface runoff, polluted with oil, gasoline, antifreeze, trash, washed from gutters to sewers to rivers by heavy rains." Unquote. Tier thinks next about drone warfare and how, quote, "the state hopes to hide from public view the human cost of war, a shame everything's stained by." The pollution he's registering is political and moral as well as material. Moreover, his awareness of anthropogenic pollution overlays his perceptions of what might otherwise seem pure. When he stops at a market stand selling fresh cut flowers, what he thinks of are the costs in environmental health of their fresh beauty. Quote, "Runoff and pesticides, sprayed day laborers sick from the exposure, thousands of pounds of carbon pumped from planes and trucks, refrigerated to get beauty here unharmed." He likens the city's beauty to that of a white lily he examines, its waxy petals stained by dark pollen. That metaphoric stain is literalized in catalog trash that emerges from the thawing ice on the city's sidewalks. Cups, plastic bottle caps, styrofoam peanuts, cigarette butts, each cast off polymer, a link in an industry chain fabricated to last. Such an implicitly judgmental presentation of the city's ugly stain seems utterly predictable in the context of the heritage of romantic nature writing. But a complicated narrative intervenes involving the poet's sexual encounter with a handsome man. Quote, "an experience all apostrophe and lubrication until he pulls out condom broken." Tier, possibly infected, goes through an HIV test and post-exposure prophylactic treatment. Quote, "I puke for a week, am not infected," he reports. But clearly he is infected, not with HIV, thankfully, but with the chemicals given him by the clinician. If he has been holding himself apart from the city's pollution as its judgmental observer whose true home is in protected lands, that is over. There is no enduring protection. And as the poem and the walks it follows continue to unfold, the emphasis is on the inescapable corporeal absorption by both human and non-human animals of all the toxic materials industrialized humans have injected into the environment. Tier perceives a fox encountered on a walk near the Wissahickon Creek, quote, "improbable there among us," as having organs heavy with the lead 36 smelters left north in the Delaware River wards. No body, we understand, is uncontaminated. Indeed, in Tear's nighttime dreams, the fox becomes the container of all the toxins of the region's industry. From its white gut, quote, spills over 300,000 pounds of sulfuric acid, 154,000 of hydrogen cyanide, 28,000 of cumene, toxics released on-site, byproducts of refining crude, shooted through wetlands off the river. This dreamt spill from the fox's guts echoes the Costco Busan spill in the book's opening poem. In the world whose material structure industrialized humans have rendered so toxic, the environmental consequences of the rupture of an animal body are a small-scale version of the puncture of an oil tanker's hull. Through the ambulatory journey of toxics release inventory, Tear demonstrates that chemical disaster is ordinary and everywhere. It may be more obvious in the city, but he makes clear that any imagining of the wild now as contrastingly pure would be willful self-delusion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lynn. I'm happy to invite our next reader. Today is David Greenspan. Welcome, David.
Hey, all. Thank you for being here. And yeah, Mary, Sarah, and Bernard, thank you for editing the anthology. And Cole and Linda, thank you for organizing and hosting. And Charles, I believe, is the one who's recording. So can everyone hear me? The little box isn't around my screen. Okay, cool. Despite being relatively young, I'm not great with Zoom. Okay, I'm going to read 3 poems. I have 2 poems in the anthology, so I'll read both of those. But then one of the poems is sort of a part of a larger project that I'm doing around some Jack Spicer poems. Spicer's after Lorca, which, as the title suggests, are translations loosely of a bunch of Lorca poems. So I'm going to read one of the Spicer poems as well. So let me pull that up, and then you all will be behind that so I can kind of hide from the digital crowd. So one of the poems in the anthology, one of my poems, is called Ballad of the Little Girl Who Invented the Universe, which is the same title of a Jack Spicer poem, which is a translation of, and actually a pretty faithful translation of a Lorca poem, Casida del Sueño al aire libre. Please excuse my pronunciation. So given the horrible pronunciation, I'm not going to read the Lorca in Spanish, but I will read the Spicer. Ballad of the Little Girl Who Invented the Universe, a translation for George Stanley. Jasmine flower and a bull with his throat slashed, infinite sidewalk, map, room, harp, sunrise. A little girl pretends a bull made of jasmine, and the bull is a bloody twilight that bellows. If the sky could be a little boy, the jasmines could take half the night to themselves, and the bull a blue bull ring of his own, with his heart at the foot of a small column. But the sky is an elephant, and the jasmines are water without blood, and the little girl is a bouquet of night flowers, lost on a big dark sidewalk. Between the jasmine and the bull, or the hooks of the sleeping people of marble, or in the jasmine, clouds and an elephant, the skeleton of a little girl turning. So that's the Spicer. And then my poem is, again, titled Ballad of the Little Girl Who Invented the Universe. Did an after Jack Spicer. I'll read that. Rows of peach trees in a commercial orchard, obedient, plush, sap-bloodied, night growing all around. A girl sprinkles her toes through the soil, adds a throat of selenite, incantations to blossom. The sky is an open mouth spitting on the girl. She doesn't notice, her attention busy in front of a small creature. The peach is an emoji, and the orchard is an iPhone, and the girl sends photos for $100 a set Between the trees and the emoji, something ordinary happens. The girl walks into traffic, her leaves steaming. The drivers see their mother's legs. So that's my English to English translation of the Spicer by way of Lorca, or maybe the Lorca by way of Spicer. Just a brief note on that and sort of the maybe departure it takes from the lineage of translation. So I had initially written a translation for and then put a person's name. The person who this was after or was for was not comfortable with having their name like in print with it. So I just kind of switched after Jack Spicer, but I was trying to, or I am still trying to do like sort of an English translation of all of After Lorca, all the poems in After Lorca, not the prose interstitials. And doing it through the lens or through the mediation of the person who I'm translating it for. So, rather than sticking with the bull and the jasmine, I was thinking, about peaches, which also have a sort of sexual connotation to them, right? I was thinking about gender, and I was thinking about sort of the natural world as mediated by technological violence, I suppose. So yeah, I have that project ongoing, and it's been really fun, sitting with those poems, and going back to some of the Lorca poems, and flexing my just incredibly horrible rusty Spanish, and trying to sort of see the connections. So the next poem that I'm going to read is called "An Animal Fat," and it's in the anthology. So I'll read that. An Animal Fat. I'd like a life of thick juniper, though I'll settle for dogwood. I've never been excitable, though sometimes I pretend to be. A possum or some other animal with dull teeth, smoked, salted, left on your back porch, a jar filled with milk, an undress followed by strong words involving thighs. You choose, please. I've never been excitable except for when I am. Tonight my muscles are curled, sprinkled with basil, bloated. I'll eat what's in front of me. I don't vomit beer. I don't vomit water. This isn't to say I won't vomit either one day. I'm excitable, or maybe I'm not. I forget, and you're not wearing underwear. I push my fingers through plants, and will you please push yours through blackberry, rub them along whatever you see fit. Afterwards, we can and will load up our guns. I've never been excitable. Of course, that's a lie, like the sugar and ants spilling over, and the marbled cut of flank spoiling on the back porch. Let's move to Seattle and start a band. Let's move to Seattle and raise a family of apple skin. So that is it for me. Thank you all so much for listening.
All right, thank you, David. Moving right along to our next reader, I would like to welcome Mei-mei Berssenbrugge. Welcome, Mei-mei.
Thank you. Try this. Now, have I done everything right? Okay.
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Let me see. I want to congratulations for everyone for the publication of ECOPOETICS, which I'm honored to be part of, and it keeps, the more I know about it, the more I see the size of the vision of the book. I'm going to read Jump Circle. It's one of the poems that I was writing over several years, in which I was thinking about stars. The initial impulse was to try to make one ecosystem between the heavens and earth. And that those poems became my book, A Treatise on Stars. Jump Circle is dedicated to Martha Reed. It's in two parts. I fall like a meteorite through the dark. A flute of light streams from the hole I make in the sky. People looking up see a dot in this beam, my arms and legs spiraling, grow still and widen their sight like a halo around me. When I land, I see crystals have fallen from my bag, and I look up at stars. 7 crystals gather to the north. I draw the Pleiades for human memory. My first task is to look across night in such a way that each crystal has a place. This story's both myth and prophecy, just as starlight reaching us already happened. The void, space-time, comes before. Then Milky Way with its 4 corners of dark, ascending and descending, gives time scansion. Looking up, you engage with elemental transparence. Pleiades, light in space-time distance, suddenly takes the form of being. This state change is intrinsic to experience. It reveals itself by circumstance, what happens. I desire to see how what happens conforms to cycle, place. When our mesa was lit by a flash, wherein my wish, rain, fell. Think of stars as ecologies of beings, substantive as angels. Up there, matter and consciousness exist as bounded levels of frequencies. Aliveness is both shared and particular to our dimension, like the light of day. There's no distinction between intent and space, because dimension is a frequency like light, not a space. As when I was a husband in previous time, or my poem was once recognized as a star. A boy points out the route his grandmother will take to the Milky Way at death. To one backlit star he assigns her returning soul. She falls through the quantum plenum, ahead of us and behind us, teleporting from a jump circle on our land, maybe to Venus or a freestanding mesa in space. Solstice, equinox, demonstrate this coherence. Frame for a story to extend. Its intelligibility is transparence in the mind of an angel, fragment of green consciousness that gives circumstance living form. I asked to connect by matching frequencies with her. She was already painting me with leaves, and everywhere she touched me, we grew. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mei-mei. The next reader today, I'm pleased to welcome Marta López-Luaces.
And thank you for inviting me to this wonderful anthology of ECOPOETICS. I'm Marta López-Luaces. I live in New York, but I'm originally from Spain. And I'm going to be reading a fragment of a very long poem. That is being translated now, and is titled "To Cut a Walnut Tree." I try to explore the connection between the extinction of animals and trees and gender violence. So I will be sharing the screen. Chopping down a walnut tree. Crows have nested in the human soul, and pain grows in the song of birds. Up there, all dawn disintegrates. To name is to dominate. Intellectual superiority, permission to hunt. Bodily superiority, permission to kill. Chopping down a walnut tree, killing an animal, killing a woman. Palm of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, extinct in 1650. A hawk crosses the morning on the silver scarlet, the summer overflow its wings, cathartic tremor of dawn ascends, because there is pain, there is weeping in the song of birds. Chopping down a walnut tree, killing an animal, killing a woman, enjoying the evil in us. Without a soul there is no pain, and we cut down a walnut tree. The Franklin tree from Georgia, extinct in 1803. We stole from the tree its nobility. We stole from the eagle the sky. We stole the darkness from the owl. Because there is pain, there is weeping in the song of birds. Tasmanian tiger, Australia, extinct in 1936. A flock of birds squirming stands, eagles, hawks, gulls, swallows, ropendolas, pigeons, greenfinches. Because there is pain, there is weeping in the song of birds. The hawk crosses a new scene, sits on the sunset, chirps, heartbreaking cry for a still life. A corner life calls up on a nymph, a thrust awaits on the iron wit's wheel. A missing deer seeks his land, a dead coyote shows him his new destiny. The inner root calls them back, but today their land is just a vanishing point of nature. Because there is pain, there is weeping in the song of birds. The bees hear the sick breathing of their queen hive hunch. Threats to nature, we lost our humanity. Persian tiger, Central Asia, extinct in 1961. Besiege nature, a web in the skyscraper, a nest on the balcony, the geese are walking among the trash on the sidewalks. The dolphin Beijing, China, extinct in 2006. The falcon fly drones, a scorn intensity, there will be no more prophecies or spells bound for our mortality. A blue of fire ripples in the limits of our own self-annihilation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Our next reader today and our final reader is Chris Pedler. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Cole, for organizing this. Thanks to Mary, Sarah, and Bernard also for editing this wonderful anthology. I'm really honored to be part of it with so many great writers. Right now, I am in San Diego. I'm reading on what is unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation. I'm going to be reading two poems, one of which appears in the anthology. The other is part of the same project, and it's about these poems are about the Coxcomb Mountains, which is an area in eastern Joshua Tree National Park, and that's land, unceded land of the Chemehueve and Serrano nations. So the first is called Narrative Space. The simplicity of surfaces deceives, especially in the desert, where the air's apparent clarity's a lacquer lathered thick upon the distances. A lens, I bend the light, which breaks and reassembles like a river while I'm driving east. The scenery unreals. Brown mountains seem to ease into valleys, but really their slopes keep going deep underground, leaving visible only the rims of bowls or tips of fingers cupped and holding the pebbles, holding the surface. Highway 62 runs over routes shaped by these ranges for trade. Trails bared by feet buried in asphalt, now traversed by ghosts. In the West, successive resurrections never kill the stench of death. In chipped stone teeth and scars from miners' picks, the granite ground with pestles left by people dispossessed, apparent wasteland wears its pain as space made present by absence. Marks on a surface conjure their startings. Little is more clear than what is invisible. Everywhere glimpse, not the rock, but the heat that shaped it, not the plain, but seas still huge and blue, not my speaking, but a set of lungs without skin, still breathing. Still in the car, film accrues on the windows and colors the view. Every desert's a Western or a road flick. Every town a set for me, the pioneer hero, to get lost in, found, and finally saved, along with an innocent maiden. This scene replays like weather makes the country taste of gunsmoke and shame. Graves I dug 100 years ago remain uncovered by names of places taken from tongues and other names that mean the same. Here is the floor of an ocean. There is an oasis, a cave that's a canvas, a painting persisting years later. None of this goes away. Each moment blows the smoke of one come before. Granite's an echo of fire, sand of rain, and I'm made of time in the library and sky. In the car, I pass the last settlement, past the sign that says, next services 100 miles. Past warehouses downsize into shacks missing windows and doors. Skulls looking stunned by the sun, their wood frames fading the shade of antique photos waiting to be taken. The future reaches back to click the shutter on the past, but leaves it open, letting light in streams deposit gold. I rushed out here to find the mines picked over, country discovered, romance erased from a myth that was always a script in the first place. Still, those absent paths blazed the only present paths and drew topographies more true than GPS. That grid exacts coordinates between the y-axis and x on a treasure map. Here, I ditch the car, where jackrabbits scatter, leaving tracks coyote track past tracks I tracked last week, finally back in the backcountry. The surface, undisturbed, preserves this record of a legible writ. This printing adds to an atlas inscribed in my mind, memorized directions describing the wild that I am and how I might get there. Let's see, the second poem's called Quantum Photography. I get lost in the desert on purpose to forget how to follow directions and to read instead the creases heat makes once unfolded from the sun. This brightness, now already 6 minutes young, take D, divide by C, get T, etches my retinas, not with rocks but sediment reflected. Time dilates, and I am its pupil, open as a student to the story that the ground tells, passing into me as light. That is to say, the present is always displaced and overlaid with echoes yesterday anticipates. Even sight refers to something other than it sees. Getting lost, you're meant to stop, think back, recall the last familiar spot, retrace your steps to get there. Memory makes the way, they say, though every bush and boulder seems the same and unlike any I have ever seen. I think this heart-shaped rock was an arrow pointing west or left from this direction, right by where my footprints left behind the tire tracks the boundary sits, its unmarked absence, presence in implicit threats of fines and tickets for litter, missing permits, trespass in a wild defined by law and title. Passing east instead of that mesquite so green-scented, screw-beamed, waxy leaves with barked, debarked, and fabric harvested, the twigs regathered fuel, pruned for coolness, food when golden, glue, its roots stuck holding signs that advertise there's water in retreat. I skirt the remnants of a wetter climate, dryness hides. Time dilates. Getting lost, my body's a use the land makes many tools of. One I use to pry myself open to the face of the range I aim to scale. Its height I read by holding out my hand and measuring my fingers. By the summit angle, name the clouds my footsteps count the distance to. Even turned around, this compass that I am knows north from found and south from going down. Direction comes through failure. Getting lost, my body's a tool I use to recognize the bodies of bushes, trees, and sheep, to mimic shifts in the wind and fit my jigsaw limbs into spaces I no longer take, but wait to be skin-haled within. My body is a tool I use to conduit rock into knowledge, translate shapes into lines of scent, a language spoken by muscles and grace. I am a guesswork of headings and pace, dead reckoned from what is without me. Matter moves by changing state. The dust motes flushed today will once upon a far tomorrow settle into sediment to rise again as mountains. In my mind, a loosely bound electric charge imagines pictures I inhabit of the West, a desert maze I double back through. This and that, a monster rock formation, a jackrabbit track, the sun pouring over a barrel cactus that I accidentally kick and recognize. My body's a tool I use to test connections. In my shoe, the cactus spine arrives as matter, in my brain as pain, as triggered recollection of a map remade correctly and giving passage, moment after moment, into different bodies, spine, stone, dirt, fur, skin together, new from accruing the light. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris Pedler. All right, so I just want to remind people to go ahead and use the chat if you have a question you want to post, or if you have your mic, by all means, feel free to jump into the discussion. Thank you, everyone, for reading today. I think Harriet Tarlow called it. She said this one was going to be a really good one.
I wanted to again, thank Charles Alexander for recording, but also thank David Weiss, who's been really a big part of the recording team too, and making all of it work. Thank you both very much. One thing I noticed today was that geology seemed to be a theme that bound things together, from Mary Beth's rock to Chris's ending with the evocations of the geology of the desert, the high California desert, and Mei-mei's stars. There's something elemental, the oil spill, all these different ways of touching on the mineral and the elemental. And I wondered if anybody wanted to talk about that in relation to their own experience or ecopoetics, etc.
Well, yeah, I noticed that too, Cole. It was so cool how it started with rock, ended with rock, and we went up to the stars in the middle. It was a lovely arc of readings. I write a lot about rocks because I think for me, it's like I find a lot of solace in thinking about geologic time and what a blip on the screen we humans are. Just brings me a lot of solace. And so I think that there's a lot to be done there in terms of recognizing the story of the planet before and after our presence on it, and thinking about what the bigger picture is. So that's something that I feel is I've seen in a lot of environmental writing as well, and something that I'm drawn to.
Oh, I have something to say. This is my first time, so can you see me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I like to think of minerals and rocks as living as alive. So they would be naturally part of the living ecosystem of Earth. And that's one thing I wanted to think about stars also as living beings.
It seems like, we live on this rock, and with certain things about the internet, but also even going back to the moonwalk and everything, we're more and more reminded how small this rock is that we live on. And that's a wonderful way to go against the other kind of smallness of how we are divided into nations and ideologies and things like that. In certain ways, we touch the earth together.
Yeah, I was interested, if I'm hearable, in how a lot of the poems this time talked about our bodies as if they were organically inside the processes that were being talked of variously, in different ways, especially given the fact that another version of poems that are equally interesting in ecopoetics terms are about an observer watching something happen that one is deeply related to, but still somehow one doesn't get inside. And it's interesting to me. I've been thinking a lot about the different tactics of how people use language and different forms or different approaches to getting into the question, like, what is the thing that we're trying to get at when we say the word ecopoetics? And there's not just one thing. So that's a little bit of a misspeaking when I say what is the thing. What I mean is, what are the things and how are they activated by the nature of the writing we're doing? And that's been a very interesting constant fascination, because there's been such an interesting range of materials covered and also ways of entering that space.
I had a similar thought to that, Rachel, and Cole, thinking back through your comment as well. I pulled from Chris Pedler's poem, "My Body's a Tool I Use to Map Connections." So there was a lot of that this time, echoing what Rachel's saying about being inside the poem. So I was thinking about, here was the question I wrote down, oddly appropriate, but where or what is your I in relation to the poem? I was thinking of, a lot about prepositions. We've been talking about within, beside, with, for. So because why I was asking that question was, another question: how does a poetics or remake an I? Is that kind of what we're doing now when we bring ourselves into the poem and what the poem is making?
Organic.
Yeah, I was thinking it's an interesting way to take it, because in a sense, the I, how big is that I? What do we see as included in that I? Seems to be an inherently an inherent aspect of ecopoetics, and the challenge to make that I a larger and more inclusive thing, I think, is sometimes a subtext in some people's ecopoetic work.
It's also difficult now to distinguish that I from the world that surrounds that I. I mean, as Lynn was talking about with Brian Tier's poems, the idea of infection, but also pollution that fits into that. And certainly I'm interested in that myself, thinking about the way in which, the metabolic processes of the earth are in fact involved in the metabolism of our own bodies. And how do we understand that as a form of writing where the I is, or we as beings are engaged in anthropogenic effects on the planet, but also that creates a kind of feedback that rewrites our bodies as well. So the I becomes, connected to its own, the inside becomes connected to the outside, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's actually really hard to get that happening in poetic conventions as many of us know them, live them, teach them, have written about them. You know, I could go on, because we really, in some sense, there's a way of leveraging that I up. But then the question is it a poem, or are you writing poetry, or where is the poetic, blah, 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 that kind of question. So really there's this interesting debate, and pull you around that, around how, in many ways, in the outcome of this is new conventions of writing. But that's very easy to say and sort of knee jerk. So I don't mean, oh, and yes, tomorrow we'll invent a whole new, you know, in fact, it's very hard to invent a new way of writing. There's a lot of resistance in oneself in the conventions one uses and the rewards and so on. But that seems to be one of the big stakes of saying ecopoetics. It's not without, this is not a totally unique thing to ecopoetics, but it is one of the stakes. Like, you have to reinvent what writing is, and that's really hard.
Yeah, and following up, Rachel, can people hear me?
Yes.
I'm really fascinated with how some of the readers today repurpose the lyric, like
now,
obviously with Marta's. Can you hear it?
No, it's switching. It's moving around. Try again.
Okay, I'm fascinated with the way.
You're getting an echo. Maybe move further back.
As per, okay. Is that better? Oh no, my internet is unstable. Sorry.
Do you want to type it into the chat?
Yeah. Well, if I can, yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can do that.
Maybe while she types, this is Jonathan here. I was interested in the fact that in several of the readings, all excellent, by the way, thank you, the preamble or the context outnumbered the poems in terms of time. So what is the role of the what is prose? What is the role of prose in ecopoetics content?
Yeah.
It's not a critique. I mean, it's a question.
And in a sense, some of the projects are in themselves. I was thinking, for instance, the thermo, Adam, your metabolic thing, where the project is a poem in itself, and then the writing about it seems a completely separate kind of poem.
The project is the procedure, right?
Is the form necessarily hybrid or ecotonal?
I would say so. I mean, I think this interests me more and more. Again, to come back to the question before about how to reinvent or rethink the poem or writing as such. I mean, what does a poetry project become then when it involves, in my case, science experiments or photographs or other things, thermal camera images. To integrate these into the poetic project is to expand in some ways how one might think of the poem or the poetry book. I don't have any easy sort of answers for this, but I'm interested in playing around with these different forms and integrating them as part of an experiment.
Yeah, it's sort of.
I believe. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I believe that ecopoetics is forcing us to rethink not just how to go to the poem from another type of language, how to reinvent poetry, but also how to reinvent humanity and the relationship of humanity with the world, with the planet. Mm-hmm. And I think it fits back from the poetry to this idea that we have to change how we relate to nature and to the world that surrounds us. So it's forcing us to also, as poets, to think how we relate ourselves to poetry and to language. I think both are connected, no? And because the ideology has to change behind the writing, behind the way we relate to the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have a question for Adam that has to do with all this. This is Marcella Duran. so that, like, you do these experiments, these somatic experiences to kind of integrate what's happening with the climate, with your body. But then do you find it difficult or limited to convey those experiences into English? Because I find so often with writing ecopoetics, you know, just in the most vague definition of the term, how limited English is to convey so many things. Like the prepositions are such a problem, and so are the pronouns, and like the prepositions in English are just such a tangle of relations that don't get to the real relations of ecology or humanity within ecology, and even geology. Trying to write around geology, so much of geology is dictated by the oil industry, that it's oil industry terms that we have to negotiate when writing into geology. So and your work in particular, I was just curious about these kind of raw sensory somatic experiments, and then articulating those into poetry, into English, and how that kind of stretched the boundaries or didn't or whatever.
Oh yeah, no, it's a key question for me. I mean, I've been dealing with that for a while because I've been working with science for a few years now. The last book I did, where I did the chemical and microbial tests of my body, I generated a huge amount of information, and I struggled with sort of thinking about different forms that this might take, because it was information that I wanted to convey through the text, but I also wanted to play formally with some of the results in a more conceptual way. And I tried all kinds of different things. I mean, I played around with it. I'm dealing with this again with this project. I mean, I think that at this point, I'm still at a point where I'm dealing with the data that I have and working with it in different ways. I didn't read some of the epigraphs and the data involved with these poems for this reading, but there is information like that integrated into the text. And I'm working out how I might present that. But I mean, in terms of developing a poetic form, I find myself drawn with this work, especially to the more playful idea of how one might think of a poetics of melting in different ways, and how that might free me for thinking about different kinds of associative logics that play around with precisely sort of contrasting the different kind of registers you were mentioning. So, I mean, that's my strategy right now, but it'll shift and move, I'm sure, over time. But what you've identified is a key question for me.
Thanks. Thank you.
Picking up on what Cynthia said in the chat about the lyric voice, the thing about a lot of the poetry we've heard in these sessions is that kind of permeability of bodies of the world is part of ecopoetics, which is really sort of drawn very dramatically in Adam's work, but also quite playfully. I'm quite glad you used the word playful, because I think there is a sort of value in wit and playfulness in terms of getting beyond the lyric I, which for years we all just kind of thought we had to suppress and repress. Then we realized that in repressing the lyric I, you're repressing the human body, which is actually the thing that's most connected to the world. And so it's like it's coming back. It's like a sort of return of the repressed, the return of the lyric I, but not lyric in the way it used to be. You can tell I've had a glass of wine.
I was thinking too, it kind of goes back to that question of, can we redefine the I so that it is not exclusively attached to and limited to a single human body, but use that I to bridge to other living things. And back to the kind of opening comment somebody made about it's being a single living organism. It's a retooling of the
I think there's a big question of the we as well in ecopoetics, in that there's a kind of even social justice we that I think once it's easy to write, not easy, but you can go a long way with thinking about a human and more than human we. And then you start getting into questions of perpetrator we's, and that it's not all humans. And there's a whole, I think it's interesting to think about how it's not just the question of the lyric I, but there's also a whole kind of social and very diverse social relationship to the world in this whole arena as well. And Ecopoetics has some of those challenges that environmentalism has, that you can even see our audience is primarily white. You know, I like the fact that this audience is a little international and a little bit more diverse, but it's just interesting how we bring some of those conversations as well into our work.
Well, I'd just like to point out, and I'm glad you brought up the we, because I feel like, you know, that's can be, depending on what you're writing about and how you're using it, that can be an alternative to the I. And one thing I like about we is you know, like if we're concerned about ecology in any sense, one of the concerns must be interconnectedness, our interconnection with the planet and with the, you know, with the broader issues of the environment, but also interconnection among humans. So no man, I might point out, is an I exclusive, nor no woman. You know, no one's, you know, no, even though I myself am kind of a hermit these days, but you know, we're all interconnected, and the we can be used to point that out.
I think also the we I slide has a lot to do with responsibility and how we're attributing responsibility or taking responsibility.
Or avoiding it.
Or avoiding it, absolutely. And so those pronouns become really charged in this way.
Especially when in an environmental context. I mean, there is no single I, right? If you think of the microbiome, we are already multiple from the beginning, right? Any one of us. And then if you think also of the mineral composition, if we start with geology and the way in which we are all made of rock from the inside out, as well as the millions of creatures inside us. So the whole thing of the I just kind of,
Yeah, but that's sort of like the problem of the pronoun, because that original I limits the vision of what you were just talking about, a collective I or we or a multiple. We're sort of multiple. They're kind of dissymmetries under one symmetry or something, and it's very hard to find a poetic, or I'm sorry, a writing convention better that actually allows that to communicate without being, let's say, only trying to like, I mean, it really communicates it. I'll stop there, but you know, that's sort of the issue that I was talking about. Not only just thinking these thoughts, which are powerful and good, but trying to instantiate them in a piece of writing that is communicative. I mean, it's just like the whole question always. That's where, when Jonathan said that, is it just the poem? I mean, it's really the poem essay. A lot of us are writing, even if it isn't quite going by that name. But it's a question of how we represent what we're talking about, which is, I mean, that's a literary question. We're doing more than literature, but yeah, anyway.
In thinking of the I as well as like a nexus or a synthesis of like a more than human occurrence through a body or something like that, or an I as representative or standing in for a larger social organization, I'm wondering how the I relates to a writing into the future, as Adam has done, or exposing the body of an I to the conditions of a potential or in an inevitable future in which the world heats up, or considering the I in relation to a deep geology, which itself feels to hold the same mystery as a future too. And like, what is the relation of like a social version of an I that reaches out to a social organization in relation to that potentiated future?
Mei-mei's future too, cosmic future, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about this distinction, the division between the living and the dead, between the animate and the inanimate, those aren't necessarily the same thing. And I was really caught, Mei-mei, by your statement that the stars are alive, or that you want to remind us of the livingness of the stars and of the stones too, one could say. So yeah, I guess I was sort of wondering about the we in terms of the living and the dead and our relationship to that distinction. So I think poetry has always trafficked on both sides of that. The we has always been sort of a company of the living and the dead. But is ecopoetics a matter of extending that to a broader sense of, or maybe challenging that, habitual division? I guess, in the current time of the dead, of sort of death, lapping at everyone's feet. I guess.
The we also excludes, not only includes, but also excludes. And I think when I write we, I'm very, very conscious that I'm excluding, that we create groups within that we. And historically, that we has always been very problematic, who is that we and who enters within that group. So when I use it in this poem is we that as a humanity created a separation from the world surrounding us. And now we have to recreate another we, which we need to connect to that nature that we are destroying. Because as long as we are separated or we are distant, using that we will keep destroying nature. So the we can be very powerful, I think, but always if we are conscious that it has been used to exclude and to distance, not just one community from another within humanity, but also to distance ourselves from nature. And so I use we knowing very consciously that is a very very difficult pronoun in that sense, that it has been used historically to create distance more than connections.
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer K. Dick. I wanted to say something a while back, really in relationship to Adam's work, but I think in a lot of the work that's coming out of ecopoetics, there's the eye of the scientific observer also. And there's something kind of, if we look back at the origin of the science, that's a questioner, right? And that we share poetry, and I think science shares that kind of purity of wanting to understand something, but not just for the self, but for something universal about the place of, everything as it is. And I think that ecopoetics is borrowing from a lot of different domains that bring that eye that is the scientist eye, the eye of the observer, the eye that sees, the eye, as well as the eye, and that we is sometimes encapsulated into that as well. Even if the person is studying like their own body, their body is seen as a parallel for other bodies, as a typic, or something. And I think that what's interesting is listening to the procedures and the methods, I see how, I really find fascinating the kind of the ways that comes out and changes and seems to be inviting new ways to look at the lyric, but also new ways to inhabit the lyric. And I just wanted to mention it for us to maybe keep that in mind as we're conceiving of what is the poetics, what's poetry, what's a poem doing. We are inundated with science right now, the inaccuracies, the desire for accuracy. And I think ecopoetics has had a long relationship with that as well.
That's a really good point, and as is the point that Maria made, because the problem is when we can't use one pronoun, we can only see pronouns as relationally in relationship to each other. So as soon as we say we and we don't say I, we say I and we don't say we, then we're losing that whole structure of thought that contains the way that we think, even if we don't want to think like that, which is why they have always to be talked about in that sort of relational sense. So that then you have also to talk about they, because when you say they, you know that you're talking about someone other, someone away from you, so you're acknowledging the limitations of we. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, I don't know why I'm saying this in front of Rachel, because she's done this all the way through all her work. And very early on when I was reading her work and she said that line, both and, I thought, oh, this solves the problem, you know, between always thinking in binaries, even when you don't want to. I mean, even what Jonathan just said then when he talked about the living and the dead, you know, immediately you're sort of setting up that binary. And I think we find it really hard to think outside binaries. I know it's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but I still find it really hard to think outside binaries because of the sort of education that I received.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. I would think a good dose of dialectical thinking would be a very nice thing. Meaning, basically, we think we create, but we are created by. And as long as you try to rethink that relationship, the betweenness is between two things, how one actually not only impinges on or pushes against, but has infused that the self, and then the self has, you know, to some damage in ecopoetics, infuse the world. But there is always this dialectics, and that's the way I like to also think about the between. We have to remember, because we're so imperial in our thinking, what you were saying, you know, we've been trained this way all the time. And that's why I like the lyric eye as well as the next guy, so to speak, but I think of it as just a little bit problematic to have only that. And this is not at all an attack on people who want to talk about it and who are very cogent about it. But there are a couple of other pronoun-y things lurking, even within that I, as I think Lynn Keller said, but might have been someone else. Anyway, I rest.
I want to go back to Alex's point about the future, because I think there's something implicit, there's an implicit tie-in here, and that is that the I, we, all pronouns are constantly evolving, and they do so by kind of extending the between into the future. Can we think of entering the future as an extension of the between, because there is no other side to a moment. It's always an extension of itself. So how can the changing of the we obviously is going to change the future as well, and to see those things as fused?
The philosopher Bernard Stiegler thinks about the constitution of a we by way of like a capacity to self-love, and self-love into the openness of like a potential future, and but also by the capacity to be empathetic or to love the other or be open to alterity. And I wonder if the future that ecopoetics is like posing to write towards is an openness, and I think it's already present so much, but an openness to the alterity of that more than human world, and like how the more than human negotiates with the human as much as the human negotiates with the more than human. And I don't know what that looks like as such, but
I think that's really interesting. And also I think it's really interesting the way that a lot of eco-critics and eco-poets recently have started using that phrase more than human, and they've abandoned that phrase non-human, precisely because they're trying to build in that wider sense of alterity and diversity, and not again be binary about, you know, human, non-human.
But don't you think also we have to think that maybe there is a border between the we and the I, the we and the you, that maybe sometimes we should try to write from that place that is not we, it's not I, it's just in the middle. And the pronouns are not really needed. Well, in Spanish, we can do that. In English, it's much more difficult. We can avoid pronouns. That we played that with that a lot in ecopoetics. It's much more difficult, I must say, in English. But I think trying to play with the borders, we is you, we is I, and it's not. And I think that's a way to create this bridge that I think with the future, with nature, with change, and it has to start with the language itself. I don't know.
Does anybody want new pronouns?
I like
really
the idea
don't.
of no pronouns. I'm really liking this idea of a pronoun-free universe and just go right to the verb.
But that could also be done through an excess of pronouns playing around with each other playfully.
Right. Because I was reading Brathwaite just for other reasons, Camo Brathwaite, and he uses mwe, M-W-E, mwe. I liked that.
Interesting.
Just a thought.
Right. I'm thinking it's like an thinking with the IU, and how quickly that could become IOU.
What about the thou? There's the Martin Buber, the I thou. I mean, there's a kind of the ode. We've heard, maybe there weren't so many odes in today's reading, but thinking of Arthur Z's voicing of salt. I don't know if that's an ode poem, but the ode is it's a form that occurs in ecopoetics, I find. The address, the apostrophe.
Which is another kind of a recognition of what we owe.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you're apostrophizing the stars, Mei-mei?
No, okay. I was trying to say something, but I didn't know how to get in. What was the question? What was the question?
You feel that you're apostrophizing the stars?
What does apostrophizing mean?
Addressing them,
Oh, yeah.
Kind of audience for the poem.
I wanted, I think I'm trying to make the stars part of we, but I wanted to say, I just thought now that our definition of life comes to us from Western science, Western traditional science, and it determines so much of how we relate to the world around us. I have a friend, his name is Chris Kempis, and he works for the Santa Fe Institute, and his project is to change the definition of life. So I was thinking that about the life and death. But with the stars, I'm just trying to make one, or what Cole says, one organism between the stars and the rest of the community. Go ahead.
The idea of changing the definition of life that's an amazing project, and it seems implicitly tangled up with ecopoetics.
Yes, it's. I think he's doing it within traditional science, but I guess obviously at the edge of traditional science. Yeah.
But it also underscores the importance of language for determining what science, quote unquote, can do and what it can't do unless it changes language.
In the relationship with science.
It's interesting to think about this too in the context of COVID-19, right? And a virus. Is a virus alive or not alive, right? This is a question that science actually has a great deal of difficulty answering, in as much as we understand the definition of life right now. So it seems like this is something worth thinking about.
Well, I had COVID very, very badly, and I experienced it, and it is alive. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my husband and I both, and when it's there, when it's active, the way you can communicate with other entities, you can communicate with this entity, and it is dynamic, beautiful, full of life. And that's another question where science says that viruses aren't alive because of certain definitions of being able to reproduce. But I don't agree with that.
I hope you're feeling better, Mei-mei.
Yeah.
You and Richard. That's quite a statement. I'm really sorry.
It's a very long process, but everyone should be super careful and do not get it. Just don't get it, you know.
Glad you're better.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to say something. Well, I'm going to try to. I've been listening. This is all very interesting. And I feel like I'm trying to think of the both and, but I still see two different eyes. And I think of what Marta has been saying, which is reminding us of our responsibility as humans and our separation from the rest of the world, the more than human, and our responsibility to reconnect and to be responsible for what we've been up to.
Yes.
And where we go from here. And I think that that's really important in ecopoetics, that we do not lose sight of that. And so a lot of times when I write the I just use a lowercase just because I just want to be humble in the face of all the other life on the planet and give them their space. And, you know, a lot of what I do feels like translation, that I'm trying to translate these other living beings' experiences in a way that other humans can relate to. And I mean, that's my guiding principle in all of my work, nonfiction, fiction, poetry, everything. At the same time, I also feel this, someone mentioned the Taoist text and in the chat. And I also feel this, that there are no boundaries, right? Mei-mei's right. I mean, everything is alive. It depends on your definition of alive. And that we are all connected and we all have all of that within and without us, you know, minerals, all life forms, bacteria, COVID, everything. And so in that sense, the I is everything. It's all that is, you know, it's the thou. And so it's interesting, this discussion, and I realize that I have been focused mainly on that idea of humans' responsibility because I feel so strongly that we got to get our act together. But at the same time, I do come from that place of the interconnectedness of all beings. You know, having studied with, you know, that idea of interbeing, and I think that when I come from that place, it helps me reveal the other lives, the other non-human lives better. At least that's my hope, because a lot of it's about humility. And I think that that humility and restraint are two big things that humans need to learn fast.
I wanted to touch on that notion of translating and using the writing to translate. And I wonder too if we could think of writing not as translating and not as speaking for something else, but as framing other things or offering frames for other things in which they can speak to us in whatever way. It's not going to be in language, but in whatever way is theirs, and somehow use language to attune our ears to the ways that other beings, objects, systems are already speaking and have a lot to say to us.
Yes, that's precisely it. I think, Cole, right? And how do we do that? You know, one of the ASLI presentations a year ago was a plant meditation that someone led, and there's plant poetics, which I've been in the last year spending a lot of time writing a lot of plant poems and trying to like spend time with a plant and let it speak. And I know it sounds very kooky, but I think that we have to go to that level of trying to find, as you said, a frame, some way to let them through with using our language. And that's the trick, is that we are still using the limits of language to communicate. Unless, of course, we're visual artists, which have a whole other realm of tools at their disposal.
Well, this may be obvious, but it seems important to remember that all these forms we're connected with are dynamic living processes and they're transient. So, you know, I think a frame is fine as long as we accept the fact that it's a moment, you know, like when Adam is talking about melting, and some, I mean, somehow to include in one's voice and one's writing that this transience, this change, this reconfiguration, you know, that even if one has a momentary insight, it's you can't sort of hold on to that, right, and create.
Yeah, and frame may be entirely the wrong word, but a way I was thinking of using language not to speak for something else, but to alter our attention so that we can come to hear it and not expect all other things to somehow speak our language and not assume that if they aren't speaking our language, that they aren't speaking at all.
Interesting what Martha
is being used loosely here because I don't
Martha
have
said,
word.
oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Martha said the we excludes, you know, by definition, and that's so. I'm interested in also in the politics of translation and where, you know, there's a language that is not ours to use, but that has something to teach us. That plant meditation reading event at Asley, I was there, and James Thomas Stevens read his Half-Breed's Guide to Native Plants, which is just a wonderful, wonderful series of poems I recommend that are sort of mixing field guide language with his own native Mohawk language. And anyways, I have a recording of it, and someday maybe he'll give me permission to post it, but he gave a wonderful sort of background to that project. But he posted recently on Facebook, you know, all these, you know, we have certain words for things, but then there are settler writers who use those words, you know, he said, but you know what, you have your own words. So why don't you use those words? You know, so there's this sort of that unevenness of who has the right to which words, I think is interesting. And it's certainly in plants, you know, there's sort of an approach to the plant. One has to be given permission in a way to name the plant in some of those traditions.
And also, depending on the language, how important nature is, you will see it in the language, in the amount of words to name just one plant or whatever. You know, I come from Spain, but I come from a place where we have a minority language that is called Gallego. And from Gallego to Spanish, I noticed that in Galicia, we are still, the countryside is still the most people live in the countryside. And in that language, we have an enormous amount of words to name the soil. You know, depending on the soil, the word will change totally. That's it. In the Spanish, already that has been lost. In English, you will have other, culturally, it's more industrial. So you have many more words than in English for industrial. So I think language is almost marked historically how humans were more and more separated from nature, depending on where we stand now. Cultures that still are very, people live in the countryside, still hold to their language, still hold and tries to connect more to that, to the country, to the nature. Those that has those cultures that have, you know, industrialized more, lost all those words. So I think the we also is part of that process. Probably the we was connected when we were living in the countryside. It was connected to the forest, to the animals, and now that we have separated ourselves from nature, we is excluding us from nature instead of including us.
I'm going to go back to Harriet's mention of the binary because it's, you know, again, the language of binarism nature creates that separation too, and tempts us to see ourselves as unnatural. And that changes, I think, not only what we feel responsible for, but it limits our ability to respond if we think of ourselves as not, as separate from nature, not. It is 40 minutes after the hour, different hour depending on where you are. But maybe a good time to let our recorders get their job done. But any closing remarks, last things that need to get said?
Thanks everyone for a great reading.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you. It was great to be a part of this.
It was wonderful.
Very much.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone, be well.
Bye.